July the 16th, 1942, at dawn, there began in Paris a vast operation of mass arrests. At the initiative of the German authorities, it mobilized over 5,000 French police and gendarmes. They rounded up the Jews whose names were on their lists.
At dawn, 2 French policemen told us, "You're going to join your mother. Hurry up." One of them added with a grin, "You have your concierge to thank. She's the one who told us where to find you."
That Black Thursday and the following day, 12,884 Jews were arrested, of whom 4,051 were children. While single people and childless couples were sent to the internment camp at Drancy, north of Paris, families were put in the Veldiv in Paris itself, where chaos reigned.
I went inside with my parents and my 2 sisters. It was hot as hell. We stayed there for several days and several nights with nothing to drink or eat.
After a few days of internment, they were transferred to camps in the Loire department of central France, from where they would later be deported to the German extermination camps.
As soon as you put a hand in this criminal machine, you were caught up in it. These are acts, quite simply, that France had to answer for and will always have to answer for.
While the Veldiv roundup was the most emblematic, such mass arrests had begun well before July 1942, and they would carry on up to the liberation. October 24th, 1940. The German Chancellor Adolf Hitler and the head of the French state, Marshal Philippe Pétain, meet in the Loire-et-Cher, also in central France, at Montois-sur-Loire station. No minutes, no account at all was published of what the 2 men said to each other, but this handshake established the basis for French collaboration. By this tacit pact with the devil, Pétain wanted to advance his pawns on the political chessboard in the context of a global conflict.
They believed that Hitler had won the war definitively, and that there was going to be a new world order in which the British and the Americans would be off in the margins, and there would be this powerful continental bloc with a victorious Germany at the center, and France wanted in on it.
If France submitted to the occupiers' orders, it was also because it didn't have a choice. It had lost the war. In May 1940, the Wehrmacht crushed the French army in 5 days. Engaged in this world war from September 1939, France suffered the worst defeat in its history. Marshal Pétain was forced to sign the armistice on 22nd of June 1940. The treaty allowed for the occupation of a part of France's territory. In the north and the west, France was to retain her sovereignty, but every decision had to be taken with the agreement of the German authorities.
Article 3 of the armistice stipulates that the French administration will collaborate with the German occupiers. It's written into the armistice, and with the word collaborate is there.
In the Free Zone, the Vichy regime set up by Pétain was able to provide itself with the government and the policies of its own choosing.
This is the heart of the conflict that was the armistice and the Vichy government's collaboration. Because right up to the liberation, Vichy repeatedly claimed that it had a sovereignty that in reality never existed. As each time the Germans tried to obtain some particular favor concerning the Jews, they got what they wanted.
During the summer of 1940, there were some 300,000 Jews living in France. Around a half of them had foreign nationality. These refugees who had fled the dictatorships of Eastern Europe had arrived in France in the middle of a financial crisis.
These refugees competed for jobs. They seemed to be diluting French culture. They didn't want to assimilate. They brought in their languages and cultural practices.
From 1940, Marshal Pétain integrated this simmering anti-Semitism in his new policy of national revolution. He wanted to fight what he called the anti-France, those responsible in his eyes for the defeat. They include the Jews, the communists, the Freemasons, and foreigners. The Jews being the common enemy of the occupying and the occupied authorities, France, like Germany, promulgated laws and directives with the aim of excluding this population from society.
Germans were obsessed with the danger to their security. For them, it was necessary to clearly identify Jews in order to avoid impure contact between German soldiers and Jews, including Jewish shopkeepers. And then there was the idea that the Jews were spies.
The stigmatization campaign began with the German directive of the 27th of September 1940. Jewish shops were from now on to display a sign reading Jewish business in their windows. And to identify this population inside French society, it ordered a census.
150,000 Jews were identified in Paris and its suburbs. So you see, 90% of Jews living in the occupied zone were in Paris. That's the place that mattered. That was the security priority as far as the Germans were concerned.
October the 3rd, 1940, the government promulgated a series of laws including, infamously, on the status of the Jews. The text of this law, that was annotated by Pétain himself, gave a definition of the Jewish race.
Are regarded as Jews all persons with 3 grandparents of the Jewish race or 2 grandparents if his or her spouse is also Jewish.
This status also forbade Jews from holding jobs in the civil service, the armed forces, the teaching profession, journalism, or the cinema industry.
There was a race on between the occupier and Vichy to see who would be the first of the two to pass such a law, as Vichy did not want to appear less anti-Semitic than the Germans.
The German objective was clearly to do with security, while Vichy's anti-Semitism was political and social. There was a real will to counter a Jewish influence they considered pernicious.
And Vichy went further still in the exclusion of the Jews. The regime passed a law giving state delegates the right to intern Jews of non-French nationality.
In the east, the Germans created ghettos and concentrated the Jewish population, but Vichy did the same thing, as more or less 1 Jew out of 4 who found himself inside the free zone at the end of 1940 was interned in an internment camp.
There were 13 main camps in the free zone. In the town of Mille, near Marseille, this vestige of history is the only camp of this size still intact today. This tile factory, first requisitioned to imprison the Reich's enemies, later served to intern foreign Jews.
Many people attempted to escape the war in Europe, and the northern zone of France in particular. They converged on Marseille in order to attempt to embark on the ships that were leaving European territory, only to find themselves trapped in our region.
The Jews who arrived in the free zone and who were taken prisoner became a reserve of Jews that Hitler would use to carry out his macabre future plan. Concentrated and isolated, it would later be easier to deport them once the order was given.
The Germans noticed that in the free zone, Vichy was holding 40,000 foreign Jews in internment camps. They also noticed that, paradoxically, in the occupied zone, no Jews were interned. It is this discrepancy that they would present to the Vichy government in order to justify the first roundup in the occupied zone.
In spite of the exodus, the Jewish population in the occupied zone remained very large. A roundup would allow for the surprise arrest and incarceration of a high number of Jews. Germany profited from Vichy's zeal and proceeded to carry out mass arrests in Paris. Then, just after the census of September 1940, it requested that each delegate in each department of the occupied zone draw up lists of Jews to facilitate the arrests.
You have got a general list that enables you to find people by alphabetical order. You have separate lists for each nationality and for each profession. There were further very useful lists by neighborhood and by address, which were sorted by street.
They were very elaborate, a very complicated filing system. It had all sorts of information in different colors, different keys, different codes. It was a lethal instrument when the time came for the Germans to start rounding up all the Jews of Paris and of the other cities.
May 1941. In the colors of Paris in the springtime, men knocked on the doors of almost 6,500 apartments. Each one had been carefully selected. The people who opened their doors simply received a piece of green paper with no explanation. Those who were out found it left at their doorways when they got home. Abram Sankiewicz was a Polish Jew. He lived in Paris with his wife and 2 children, Louise and Rachel.
My father received a green ticket for the 14th of May 1941. You are required to present yourself at the Tourelle barracks in the 20th arrondissement of Paris for, as they put it, status verification. And it was written that there would be sanctions for those who did not go.
They didn't yet know, but this order was in fact a perfectly orchestrated roundup. The first of a long and macabre series. For all of these men had something in common. They were Jewish, Polish or stateless for the most part. On the day of the roundup, Jews left their homes and made their way to the different assembly points.
I think it was at dawn, at 7 o'clock in the morning, that I had to present myself. My father kissed us and said, "See you this evening," and we never saw him again.
Like for Abram Sankiewicz, as soon as they arrived, French police confiscated their identity papers.
German police give the orders and the French police carry them out.
Of the 6,500 people summoned, 3,747 came forward.
That was a failure rate of 42%. That was high. So, on future occasions, the Germans invented other methods for arresting Jews.
The people who had been rounded up were transported by bus to Austerlitz station, where they were put on trains for the camps at Pithiviers and Beaune-la-Rolande in the department of the Loire, 100 kilometers from Paris. They were the first people to be interned in the occupied zone. June 1941. The segregation measures were tightened, excluding larger and larger parts of the Jewish population from society. The census was extended to the free zone. Vichy threatened those who didn't cooperate with internment in a special camp, even if they were French. The Jews also had their possessions taken away from them. Shopkeepers and industrialists were no longer allowed to manage their businesses.
Up until that time, Vichy had avoided engaging in plunder. This was a German policy practiced in the occupied zone. But now Vichy passed a law of dispossession, the law of July 22, 1941, managed on a bureaucratic level by the Commissariat for Jewish Affairs. In total, there would be 50,000 cases in the 2 zones.
Jeannette lived in Paris with her Polish Jewish parents. She remembers this period.
We had a shop in the Rue Saint-Martin where we sold work clothing wholesale, work shirts, things like that. The goods weren't confiscated, but someone was put in charge of the shop.
The police adapted themselves to their new mission as persecutors, whether or not they received orders from the occupying administration. In the summer of 1941, Germany unleashed its biggest military operation of the Second World War under the codename Barbarossa. Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. The riposte was immediate.
The communist resistance particularly began assassinating German officers, and the Nazis are getting more and more edgy and anxious about the presence of Jews in the occupied zone of France.
Faced with this threat, the German authorities were convinced they needed to take hostages who they could execute as reprisals for future attacks.
This was without doubt the reason for which the Germans gave the order to organize a massive roundup of foreign Jews in the heart of the French capital in August 1941.
2,400 French police, supervised by the German military police, were given the task of making the arrests. Their target, the 11th arrondissement, the neighborhood with the largest Jewish population. On August the 20th, 1941, at 5:30 in the morning, all the entrances to République and Nation metro stations were blocked.
The 11th arrondissement of Paris was sealed off. by the French police. No one could go in or out without checking their ID. And this way they had a kind of dragnet and caught any Jews that were out on the street.
It was the second roundup to sweep Paris in 3 months, and the biggest ever carried out in France, in the heart of the capital. All Jewish men from 18 to 50 years old, French and foreign, who were found on the street, were arrested.
These results were disappointing, so at the end of the day on July 20th, 1941, the Paris police gave the order to go and arrest Jews in the other parts of the city.
In the end, the roundup lasted 4 days. From August 20th to 23rd, 1941, 4,232 Jews were arrested.
This roundup was hugely significant because hitherto arrests had been carried out individually. The police went to get people at their homes and brought them to the police station. It wasn't done in the full view of the general public. But here, you had an enormous police operation ordered by the Germans and carried out by the French police that took place in the middle of Paris in front of the French population at large.
After this roundup, Parisians became more aware and more concerned about what was happening to the Jews, especially as, for the first time, French nationals had been arrested. All were transported to the new internment camp at Drancy, situated a few kilometers from Paris. Four months later, on December the 12th, 1941, a third roundup was organized in Paris. This time it was carried out by German gendarmes assisted by French police. Their target was quite different.
They arrested the important people, the doctors, the lawyers, people who had been decorated with the Legion of Honor, more than 100 war veterans.
In total, 750 Jews, obtained by sifting through the famous lists. Most of them were French. Arresting this category of professionals and French nationals was considered an affront to the Vichy regime.
And this was a great shock to Vichy because it called their sovereign authority into question.
Even the General Commissar for Jewish Affairs came close to a shouting match with a German officer saying, "This operation is an aberration. You could have chosen between thousands and thousands of undesirable Jews, and instead you deliberately chose to arrest the most honorable. It's absurd. It's stupid."
Those who'd been rounded up were sent to the Royal Ure camp in Compiègne, in the Oise department north of Paris. They would remain there for 4 months. On March the 27th, 1942, the prisoners left for Auschwitz. This photo is unique. It shows the first convoy of deportees and marks the beginning of the horrific Nazi policy that was being put in place. January the 20th, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich, one of Hitler's right-hand men and director of the Reich Main Security Office, convened a meeting of some 15 Nazi dignitaries in a magnificent house in Wannsee outside Berlin.
He explains to them Hitler's will that the Jews should be exterminated from Europe and all the occupied countries must participate, and they're going to rake the Jews out of Western Europe from west to east.
At the end of the Wannsee conference, the minutes show the number of Jews that are to be assassinated. 11 million. On the 12th line figures France and its 165,000 targeted Jews. The dignitaries also reflected upon how the final solution of the Jewish question was going to be reached.
The decision was taken to create extermination camps. It was a move towards an industrial solution, the extermination of Europe's Jewish populations.
The infernal Nazi machine was started up. A few months later, France would be one of the theaters with one of the most violent roundups ever organized. Theodor Dannecker, chief of the Gestapo's Jewish Affairs Service, was in charge of implementing the final solution in France. To accomplish this extermination mission, it was necessary to organize roundups on a grand scale.
But the Germans needed the French police because there was never enough German manpower, particularly after the Russian war, got to be so stressful.
To lead this macabre plan to a successful conclusion, new players came to the fore in the spring of 1942. General Karl Auberg was named higher SS and police leader in France.
And his arrival coincided more or less with René Bousquet taking up the post of General Secretary of the Police in France.
He was only 33 years old, but he had ambition. By creating new police schools teaching the surveillance and identification of suspects, he wanted to show the Germans that his administration was modern and effective.
It was he who, when he first met high-ranking German officials in Paris on May 6, 1942, suggested in an aside that he could give them 10,000 foreign Jews from the Free Zone. If the German police would like to take them, the Vichy police would be happy to provide them.
One pragmatic suggestion that was in the interests of the regime.
The Vichy regime was happy and indeed eager to assist with the removal of the foreign Jews who had been the cause of their troubles in the 1930s. They've been put into camps at the outbreak of the war as foreigners at the cost of the French government.
If Vichy was ready to give the Germans a helping hand, its objective was different from that of the Reich and the final solution.
Vichy didn't want the Jews killed. That was not its aim. Vichy wanted to exclude the Jews from the civil service and from business, to rob them and ruin them.
To easily distinguish the Jews from the non-Jews, the German authorities had an idea: forcing them to wear a yellow star. The French police assured that this new decree of 29th of May 1942 was applied in the occupied zone for French and foreign Jews from the age of 6 onwards.
Dad said to Mum, "There's no way we're going to go and get that. We're leaving for the Free Zone." And Mum, who was very legalistic, said, "Oh, the government said so. I'll go and get it."
Joseph is a Polish Jew. He remembers the first time he left the house wearing his yellow star.
Of course, the first thing I did was to hide my star. And I felt, it's hard to find the words, like less than nothing. They wanted to convince us, and we were convinced, that we were subhuman, inferior beings.
This very stigmatizing star aroused, against all expectations, a wave of sympathy. In a gesture of solidarity, some people wore stars they made themselves, with Catholic, or Auvergnat, or Breton marked on them.
People understood that the Jew, the demonic figure of Nazi and French propaganda, wasn't necessarily this ethereal figure, but a staunch neighbor from the 3rd arrondissement. They're kids who go to school with your kids, the man mutilated in World War I that you see in the street.
The yellow star was not imposed on the Jews living in the Free Zone. Vichy had no desire to foster sympathy for the Jews. The authorities used a much more underhand method: a stamp with Jew written on it in red capital letters affixed to their identity papers. But the measures didn't stop there. In July 1942, the Jews were forbidden from entering a number of public places.
The objective was, in reality, to push bit by bit out of society the Jewish population, with German measures that were even more drastic than those put into place by Vichy.
Anti-Semitism rapidly became the norm for the entire French administration, which participated, with different degrees of zeal, in its establishment. Summer 1942. Hitler is confronted with total war. While some of his troops had just entered the Libyan town of Tobruk, others were beginning the Battle of Stalingrad in Russia. The dictator needed manpower. Before exterminating the Jews, he would use them to bolster the war effort. The demands on the French became weightier.
And suddenly, Pierre Laval, the head of the Vichy government, and its police chief, René Bousquet, were told they needed to provide straight away 40,000 Jews. So here was real pressure on Vichy, very strong pressure. General Auberg told Pierre Laval that the trains were ready to go.
July 1942. Meeting followed meeting to organize the execution of the final solution in France.
It's not just about deciding we want to deport Jews, this is how it's going to happen. You also have to think about, is there the railway material available in order to allow these deportations to happen? And then the SNCF will be required to produce the material and squeeze the trains into their timetables, which are already running and already planned.
From mid-July, 3 convoys of deportees were scheduled each week over a period of 3 months.
Ultimately, the SNCF was a cog in the wheel of the final solution. What's important to understand is that the days on which people are deported are not decided by the French railways. They are decided by ministerial meetings, by Berlin, by Vichy.
In order to attain the target of 40,000 Jews, the groups being rounded up were constantly changing.
In Theodore Daniker's mind, he had been doing the sums. It was working-age Jews, foreigners, and French. The age limit changed very quickly. First, they talked about 18 to 45, then 55, because they wanted to arrest the right number of Jews, and in order to do so, they would slide the age limit up or down.
A new twist in the horror. On July the 6th, 1942, Theodore Daniker, the chief of the Gestapo's Jewish Affairs Service, sent a telegram to Berlin. It carried a cruel Vichy suggestion.
President Laval proposed for the deportation of Jewish families from the non-occupied zone that they also take the children of under 16 years old. The fate of the Jewish children who remained in the occupied zone was not his business.
The head of the government wanted to send children to the camps before the Germans had even asked them to do so.
If you don't take the children as well, that means separating them from their parents, and that will appear inhuman to the non-Jewish population of France. That would lead to more protests, and he knows it.
Laval was afraid that he would have all these orphans on his hands. The French would have to feed them, and he wanted them to go with their parents.
There was also debate over the nationality of the deportees. Whether or not French Jews should be rounded up and deported along with the foreign Jews divided opinion inside the Vichy government. It was René Bousquet, the General Secretary of the Vichy Police, who was in charge of the negotiations.
So we're going to give you 40,000 Jews, but that number will only be made up of stateless Jews. And it will be the French police who will conduct operations autonomously. That was the monstrous deal dreamed up by Bousquet and approved by Marshal Pétain.
By only handing over foreign Jews and by reserving the roundup for its own police, France thought it was maintaining its sovereignty. The criteria for deportation were decided and would be applied starting on July the 16th, 1942 in Paris, for the biggest roundup of Jews ever undertaken, the Veldiv Roundup. Between the 7th and 10th of July, the Gestapo worked out the fine logistical details of this gigantic operation. It convened in its offices all the heads of the different police services.
They had 25,000 forms ready for this operation. The Germans, like the French, were counting on 22,000 arrests.
Every police station received orders regarding the roundup, a list stripped of all humanity.
Operations must be carried out without unnecessary talk. There should be no discussion of their state of health. Children will also be taken. They must not be given to neighbors to look after. Animals will be given to the guardian.
As for the place where these people would be brought, it would be the Vélodrome d'Hiver, the winter cycling stadium, situated a few hundred meters from the Eiffel Tower.
They had to find a place to put 12 or 15,000 Jews, and so they chose this bicycle stadium, which is called the Vélodrome d'Hiver. And it's called for short the Veldiv.
As for childless adult Jews, they were sent directly to the camp at Drancy, a few kilometers from Paris. On this July the 15th, 1942, the atmosphere was as heavy as the heat wave that had hit the capital. Among Jewish families, the rumors were spreading.
The news started to spread before the beginning of operations for one simple reason. Thousands of Paris police were involved.
On the eve of the roundup, an inspector who was a friend of Dad's came to tell Mum that on the 16th of July there was going to be an enormous roundup. But we didn't move because Dad wasn't there.
Many believed that only men were going to be arrested. While there was still time, some fled to the free zone. This was the case for Jeanette's father. On the 16th of July 1942 at 3 o'clock in the morning, they launched the operation. The entire police force, plus reinforcements drafted in, formed teams.
They always used teams of two so as to avoid any collusion that would lead to the failure to arrest the Jews. When you're with a second policeman that you don't know, you're wary. It was clear everything had been done to make sure the operation would be effective.
Armed with their lists, the teams arrived at thousands of dwellings where their inhabitants were still asleep.
At dawn, there was a loud banging on the door of my grandparents' house, and two policemen said, "Hurry up. You have 5 minutes to pack your bags because we've got a lot of people on our list," in a tone that was not very nice.
In Rue Saint-Martin, the police knocked on the door at Jeanette's house.
Mum arrived with my little brother. She said to them, "My husband isn't here." One of them said, "We'll take the woman and the kids." The second said, "It's going to be more trouble than it's worth with a woman and 2 children." And they left. It's a miracle. They left.
Rachel and her sister didn't have the same luck. Discovered hidden at their grandparents' house, they were sent with their mother to the Bellevilloise sorting centre set up in the 20th arrondissement. It was full of families, with some children as young as 2.
My mother had one idea in her head. We had to escape. She went from one acquaintance to another saying, "No, they're not taking us to Germany to work. They're lying. We're not going to be able to work with kids to look after." And the other mothers were angry with her because that was not something they wanted to hear.
Then Rachel's mother learnt that a neighbour's daughter had succeeded in escaping via an emergency exit. She wanted Rachel and Louise to flee the same way.
I didn't want to leave my mother. I screamed, "I don't want to leave you." I screamed very loudly, and my mother slapped me. The only time in my life anyone had ever slapped me. We went towards the emergency exit, and there the police on guard duty turned the other way, so as not to see us leave.
That slap saved her life, as did the policeman on guard duty near the door. The 2 young girls ran back to their grandparents' house. They were not taken during the roundup. Rachel's mother, who passed herself off as a spinster, was sent to Drancy. The families, meanwhile, were taken to the Vélodrome d'Hiver in Rue Nélatan. The president of the Sons and Daughters of French Jewish Deportees Association, Serge Klarsfeld, wanted to show us where the deportees found themselves on that Black Thursday.
This is the exact place where the entrance of the Vélodrome d'Hiver stood. On July 16, 1942, a huge roundup was organized where, for the first time in France, Jewish families, men, women, and children, were arrested.
Joseph, who was arrested later, arrived in the early afternoon in this enormous crowded complex. Thousands of people had already been confined there.
I entered the place. It was overpoweringly hot. It stank. It was incredibly noisy and violently lit up. There was a lot of disorder and confusion. I saw a woman throwing stadium seats from an upper gallery that landed on the people below in a pool of blood. This image still chills me when I think about it. It's the 11-year-old child who's talking to you here.
Hundreds of Jews continued to arrive at the Veldiv up until the next day.
The roundup stopped at 1 p.m. on July 17th. 12,884 Jews had been arrested by then.
These men, women and children would remain cooped up in the sweltering heat with nothing to eat and nothing to drink for 6 days.
The crowds who found themselves at the Veldiv on the 16th and 17th of July 1942 and up until the 22nd of July weren't crowds who'd stay a few hours. It was 6 awful days and, above all, they didn't know what awaited them.
While Berlin hadn't yet decided what should be done with the children, it seemed impossible to leave them in the chaos of the Veldiv in the middle of Paris. A temporary solution was found. They would be sent with their parents to the camps at Pithiviers and Bon-la-Rolande.
And here you have a wall with, inscribed upon it, the names of the 4,000 children who were deported after being arrested on the 16th and 17th of July, who were here at the Veldiv.
Joseph Weissmann was not on that mortuary list. He was, however, one of those who left the Austerlitz station for the camps in the Loiret in the center of France.
We saw the immense trains, as long as the eye could see, the cattle wagons, the freight train wagons with horses 8, men 40 written on the side. They got us on board at over 200 people per wagon.
Barbarity has no limits. The transportation of the Jews in these cattle wagons served a precise practical purpose.
It's much easier to guard the people that are inside and to prevent escapes. So you needed, 5 times more people to guard a deportation train made up of passenger cars. With cattle cars, you shut them, and you need much less surveillance.
After a trip carried out in abominable conditions, the small boy arrived at the camp of Bon-la-Rolande. He stayed there for 2 weeks with his sisters and parents until the day of his deportation and the atrocious family separations. Certain children, like Joseph, were not part of the convoy.
It was the worst horror you could imagine. The grief for the children and the grief for the parents. And I think it was after having lived through this that I first smelled death. It was inhuman, so I had to get out.
After several attempts, the young Joseph and his friend Joe escaped during one mealtime when all the inmates were inside the barracks. An epic escape bid through thick fences of barbed wire that lasted 6 hours.
We were halfway through, and we said we'd done something stupid. We couldn't go on. We were exhausted. We had no strength left. Then, luckily, after we'd rested a bit, we said, going back is going to be as hard as going on, so let's keep going.
The courage of those small boys saved their lives. For the others, their destiny was in the hands of Berlin. On the 13th of August, the decision was announced. The children would be deported. Sent to the Drancy camp, then to Auschwitz. They were gassed immediately.
The children were deported, and the children had French nationality, so the French were deported nevertheless.
The agreement reached between the chief of SS police Karl Auberg and the chief of the French police René Bousquet not to round up French Jews had not in the end been respected. If the Veldiv roundup was the most emblematic, it was not the only one. Mass arrests were carried out all over France, in the free zone as well as the occupied zone, from July the 15th till the end of the summer 1942. Almost no region was spared. Everywhere Jews had been counted in the census, they were rounded up.
Hitler wants to eliminate all the Jews of Europe, and he doesn't care whether they're in occupied France or unoccupied France, or in other occupied countries. He wants them all.
In Nancy, in the occupied zone, the roundup of the 19th July 1942 was a fiasco. There were only a dozen arrests in a city where several hundred Jews should have been arrested. It was the only failure.
This roundup failed thanks to one man who was the head of the foreigner service of the Nancy police. He practically ordered all of his men to go and warn everyone in the city that there was going to be a roundup the following day.
These people left or went into hiding. The day of the roundup, there were so few arrests that the Germans preferred to cancel the convoy for Auschwitz. In the free zone, René Bousquet would attempt to hand over the 10,000 Jews he had promised in May. The French government first transferred interned Jews to camps in the south of France.
There are about 3,500 people, adults, men and women. Then it was the turn of the men who were incorporated into the foreign workers groups along with their wives in some cases. 1,000 people.
It still wasn't enough to reach the 10,000 Jews Bousquet had promised. The police chief decided at that moment to launch a major program of arrests in the free zone.
The roundup of 26th of August 1942 was politically important because here was an operation that was organized by Vichy at the request of the Germans in territory where the Germans were completely absent, and which shows full and complete collaboration of the French state in the carrying out of the final solution.
The different police services, the mobile reserve guards, the gendarmes and the army were all mobilized to sweep the 40 departments of the free zone. On the evening of August the 28th, 1942, the main police station of every department communicated the number of Jews it had managed to round up. In all, nearly 7,000 Jews thanks to this vast operation.
The 26th of August operation was much bigger than the final number suggests because, in order to gather together 7,000 Jews to be handed over to the Germans, there were perhaps as many as 20,000 arrests.
The people rounded up in the Marseille region were sent to the Mille camp. Before their departure for Auschwitz, all of these people were sorted by commissions, set up to decide who would go next.
At 5 o'clock in the morning, everyone had to assemble in the courtyard. Everyone had to come down with all their possessions, a minimum of baggage, and wait for the list of names to be called out to see who had been chosen to leave on the next convoy.
The ones selected were escorted to the deportation platform, which was only 300 meters from the tile factory where the inmates were confined. This proximity made this moment all the more harrowing for those who stayed behind. From their windows, they saw and heard the cries of the wretched individuals who were about to be deported.
It caused a lot of suffering and a number of suicides, in particular the suicide of a mother who had 2 babies who decided to throw herself out of a high window with her babies in her arms simply because her husband was leaving with their eldest child in the convoy.
Before leaving, the train might stay at the platform for 48 hours. For some didn't answer the roll call. The police had to go and find deserters hidden in the internment camp.
It was a very large building, a tile factory that wasn't at all built for interning people. By removing part of the roof, some inmates had succeeded in going and hiding in its windowless rooms. Others, adolescents mainly, went onto the roof to hide behind the chimneys.
Not all were lucky enough to escape deportation. In that summer of 1942, 2,000 Jews, men, women and children, left the Mille camp for Auschwitz.
In the summer where the heat is so intense that it leads to suffocation and even death before arrival to the camp at times. The reality is also that this will be a very long journey. You have very long stops at certain railway stations. And that makes it even more agonizing for those who are inside the deportation convoys.
The quota of 10,000 Jews had been met, but the Germans weren't going to stop there. They wanted 25,000 more arrests before November, before the possible suspension of the convoys during winter. Angered by this constant pressure, The government chief, Pierre Laval, refused this latest demand.
Enough was enough. After the handing over of 40,000 Jews, there wouldn't be any more. There were no more Vichy government orders to local administrations to round up Jews because there was no longer any question of handing over Jews to Germany at that period.
After having discriminated powerfully against Jews in 40 to 42, Vichy did indeed try to slow down the deportations of French citizens.
From October 1942, the Germans could no longer count on massive and systematic French collaboration. If roundups were going to take place now, they would require the zeal of local administrators such as the state delegates of the Marseille area a few weeks later. On November the 8th, 1942, British and American troops landed in North Africa.
There they are on Hitler's doorstep, and at that point Hitler thinks that they're probably going to land in southern France. He sends these troops into the unoccupied zone.
On November the 11th, the German and Italian invaders share out what is now called the Southern Zone. Mussolini's army occupies most of the southeast. The city of Marseille, a possible entry point for the Allies, is put in the hands of the Nazis. It was to become the target of a roundup of large proportions.
This was a very special operation. First of all, because it was decided in Berlin by Heinrich Himmler, who was obsessed with the danger that Marseille represented. In Nazi fantasy, there was clearly a danger of epidemics, because it was a port and the city was, they believed, run by the local mafia.
From the 22nd to 27th of January 1943, the French and German police arrested all the Reich's opponents who had come and taken refuge in the city.
The Marseille roundup was exceptional because it wasn't only directed towards the Jews, but also those considered ruffians, asocials, pimps, and also the Jews.
In all, 5,956 people were rounded up, among them at least 782 Jews. They were deported to the Sobibor camp in Poland. None of them would survive. Without French collaboration, the roundups were less effective. The deportations slowed.
From the spring of '43, a train was made available when there were enough Jews to deport, and for that it was necessary to arrest Jews.
The Germans took charge of the roundups. They even arrested people in hospitals and orphanages. In 1943, the young Rachel was hiding in Paris, but her hiding place was anything but safe.
The Germans dispatched convoys of 1,000 people to Auschwitz. And when they had, for example, 900 or so, they would come into the children's centers to complete their human cargo.
After his escape from the Beaune-la-Rolande camp, Joseph had managed to take a bus to the capital. As the only survivor from his family, he hoped he'd be safe in the orphanage in Rue Lamarck.
In 1943, the director said, "You know, I can't keep you here any longer. There have been 2 or 3 times now when the gendarmes nearly got you when they arrived. So you're going to leave Paris. We're sending you to the countryside." And he sent me to the Sarthe, where I lived in hiding.
All the Jews attempted to escape the police controls, and many of them took refuge in Nice, in the southern zone.
Jews who are terrified of being arrested and deported rush into the Italian zone in the summer of '43. Nice had been the principal city of the Italian zone. It was full of Jews.
It was practically the only part of Europe that was in the hands of the Third Reich and its allies where the Jews were safe. And then, suddenly, a tragedy occurred.
The Allied landing in Italy in July 1943 provoked the collapse of the Mussolini regime. His troops pulled out of the French occupation zone, which was immediately invaded by the Germans. On September the 10th, 1943, Alois Brunner, an officer expert in the organization of roundups, was hurried to Nice. The number of Jews deported from France had been dropping, and he had been nominated to reverse the tendency. he had to act without the collaboration of the French police.
Vichy is going to disengage from direct collaboration. In other words, they will continue to practice a policy of anti-Semitism, but if you want to arrest Jews in what has become the southern zone, it's up to you to arrest them.
It is clear by this time that Germany is going to lose the war. So Laval and Bousquet are a little less enthusiastic about the idea of collaborating.
Brunner had at his disposal an SS commando of only 20 men. He didn't know the language or the terrain, so to help him with his mission, he recruited hundreds of local ultra collaborators. Among them, members of the French Popular Party militia.
Jews were arrested mostly by the Gestapo, assisted by French accomplices, which is to say people who, out of ideological conviction or because they were paid to do it, proceeded to arrest Jews.
Together, they began operating throughout the city of Nice. Their aim was to track the dispersed and hidden Jewish population wherever it was.
We went from a period of roundups to one of tracking and hunting. So they would target living quarters, hotels, furnished rental accommodation, boarding houses, and bars and restaurants too. Most Jews no longer had jobs, so they met up where they could.
The roundups were particularly violent. The Germans carried out brutal interrogations in the rooms of the Excelsior Hotel, Brunner's headquarters. The SS chief's men tortured Jews to make them give their identity and reveal where other Jews were hiding.
The roundups were brutal because the Germans were fanatical. They anticipated their defeat, and defeat for a Nazi fanatic was the Jews' fault.
Faced with this danger, Jeanette's parents, who had taken refuge in Nice, decided to entrust their children to the rescue network set up in the region by the couple Dr. Odette Rosenstock and Moussa Abadi.
One evening, Mum and Dad took us to the famous address that Dr. Rosenstock had given Mum. I was 13 and a half. I was very conscious that I was going to stay with my little brother and that Mum and Dad were going to leave. My little brother, on the other hand, was young. He was 7 and a half, and he had a feeling of abandonment that has never left him.
Moussa Abadi took them to a Catholic boarding school and gave them fake identities.
It was easy with me. I was grown up. He said, "Your name is Jeanne Moreau. You were born in Marrakesh." "Very good, sir. I got it." But with the little ones, you needed to drum it into them. At first, they thought it was fun. Then he said, "A piquette," and he called them by their old name. They weren't supposed to turn their heads. Most of the time, they replied to their old name.
In total, 527 children hidden by Moussa and Odette were protected and saved. Thanks to these acts of solidarity, many Jews in the region escaped the clutches of Alois Brunner.
The haul from these roundups was 3,500 Jews out of 25,000 who lived on the Riviera. They arrested 3,500 Jews. The French police would have arrested more Jews in one night than they had arrested over several months.
The end of the war was fast approaching, and to the very end, the Nazis continued to arrest Jews, no longer with any consideration for their nationality.
When Bousquet was dismissed by order of the Germans in December 1943, he was replaced by a militiaman called Joseph Darnon, and he accepted that the French police would arrest French Jews.
The roundups of 1944 surprised French Jews living in the occupied zone.
In Bordeaux, most Jews who'd reasoned that up to now they hadn't been targeted were arrested. That made the Bordeaux roundup formidably effective. More than half the Jews were at home when the roundup happened. That was enormous.
When the local police didn't want to cooperate, the Germans took charge of operations themselves, as in Nancy in March 1944, where all the Jews remaining in the city were deported. In Paris, the manhunt was increasingly difficult, but the Gestapo was able to count on numerous letters of denunciation. They were transmitted to special French police brigades, who would then carry out the arrests.
I denounce the completely Jewish family who live at 46 Rue Godefroy Cavaignac, who have been dealing on the black market for a long time. They live in a flat on the first floor.
Of the 15,000 Jews who were deported in 1944, most of them had been hunted down, and I estimate that a third were arrested after being denounced. So you see, it was enormous.
The police also exploited the smallest bending of the rules. The wearing of the yellow star remained a foolproof way to arrest and deport Jews, both French and foreign.
There was a train just about a week before Paris was liberated. It did continue. Things like the expropriation of Jewish property continued right up to the end.
Almost all of France's territory had been liberated, so the final solution was brought to a halt. Not because the Germans weren't able to organize it, but because the Allies liberated French territory so quickly.
Between the 27th of March 1942 and the 17th of August 1944, 79 convoys left France, taking almost 76,000 people to their deaths.
There were another 3,000 Jews who were in the French camps and died there of typhus or malnutrition or what have you.
Could France have avoided handing over its Jews? Today, there's no doubt about it.
Without Vichy, there would never have been roundups organized in France. What we mean by roundups isn't the operations organized by the German police in 43 or 44, it's the Veldiv and its 13,000 victims. It's the roundup in the Free Zone and its 7,000 people who were arrested and handed over to the Germans. It's the Marseille roundup, it's the February 43 roundup.
Vichy's responsibility is great, because it offered up the use of its police department, and unfortunately, its police proved very effective.
It wasn't until the 16th of July 1995 and the speech by President Jacques Chirac that Vichy's responsibility in the deportation of French Jews was recognized at last. An overdue recognition that left many of the actors in this genocide unpunished. Aloïs Prunaire escaped judicial proceedings. René Bousquet served only 3 years in prison. As for Marshal Pétain and Karl Auberg, who were condemned to death, in the end, they were pardoned.